All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Joe Kable. Joe Kable is the Baird Term Professor of Psychology and Marketing at the University of Pennsylvania. He studies the psychological neuromechanisms of human decision-making using an integrated empirical approach that borrows from economics, the psychology of judgment and decision-making, as well as social and cognitive neuroscience. He received his BS from Emory University in 1996 and his Ph.D. from neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania in 2004. He's a postdoctoral scholar at the Institute for Disciplinary Study of Decision-Making, NYU, before rejoining Penn in the Department of Psychology in 2008. He's the past recipient of an Early Career Award from and the current past president of the Society for Neuroeconomics. His research has been supported by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIMH, NCI, and the National Science Foundation. He's given talks at the Franklin Institute and the Philadelphia Science Festival, and his work has been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, Newsweek, NBC News, and Freakonomics.com. We're very excited to have Joe here today to talk about prospection. Please join me in welcoming him.
Is the mic on? Okay. All right. Yeah, because I think we have people listening in from afar, so I want to make sure that they can hear me. So thank you for the introduction, Warren. Thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm so glad to be here. There's lots of great people to talk to who are doing related work, and I'm glad to get a chance to tell you a little bit about what we're doing in the area. Just to sort of set the stage and sort of start with the motivation for the work that we're going to do today, that I'm going to tell you about today. I have been teaching first years cognitive neuroscience, and so that leads me to think a little bit about what do we count as knowledge within the field? What do we think of as we've made progress on understanding the brain? And if you sort of look at first year cognitive neuroscience text, one of the things that you sort of teach in the first couple of weeks is about functional specialization within the brain. And we talk about the functional specialization of the where and the what visual pathways. And so this, if we take what we teach first years as an example of what we take as progress and what we take as we really have things figured out, we really have things figured out when we can say something about, how different brain regions are specialized. And we've made a great deal of progress in understanding functional specialization within sensory processing regions. And in particular, we've made an enormous deal of progress within neuroscience understanding specialization within visual processing regions. This is a famous graph from David Van Essen laying out the 20-some-odd different areas within the visual cortex and how they're tiled to each other, and we know something about how each of these regions is specialized in terms of what it's processing in the visual world. And this is great. There's only one problem with this as sort of representing progress brain-wide, which is about half the time when we're walking around the world and our eyes are open and these visual areas are going, there's nobody home paying attention. This is one of my favorite studies in psychology done by a colleague of mine at Penn, now Matt Killingsworth, where all Matt did was do an EMA-type study, probe people and say, what are you doing right now? And so what you can see here on the size of these circles is just how often they're doing that thing. And then what they were interested in this study, this axis here, is how happy are you at the moment doing that thing. And so the point that Matt and Dan Gilbert wanted to make is that when people are not in the moment, they tend to be more unhappy, right? So if they're not sort of present in the moment, paying attention to the stimuli that are coming in through the retina, they tend to be less happy. But what what we can take from it is about half the time, if you add up these circles relative to these circles, people are actually not thinking about the stimuli that are coming in through their sensory organs. They're thinking of, their mind is wandering, and they're thinking about something that's not in the here and now. And so if I were to ask my colleagues, well, what do we know about the brain regions? We know about the brain regions that do this stuff. What do we know about the brain regions that do this stuff? They would go, well, we know a little bit about that. We've done these resting state functional connectivity studies, and it seems like there's these areas of the brain called the default mode network, shown here in red. They're interconnected at the resting state, and we think that those resting state networks, we think that this default mode network, that's involved in thinking about the not here and now, whether you're remembering the past or imagining the future. And the starting point for today's studies is that if I went to a visual physiologist and said, we figured out vision, there's this visual network in the resting state, and it's this big chunk of the back of the brain, and we understand how vision works, they would laugh at that level of understanding from a functional specialization perspective. And so what I'm going to try and do today is just push us one tiny step forward in understanding functional specialization within these networks with respect to prospection, with respect to what people are doing when they're not thinking about the here and now. And so this is the outline of the talk for today. About the first half, I'm going to talk about a study that we did trying to fractionate the prospective brain, and then that ends up dividing the default mode network into two subnetworks, which we think are involved in the evaluative and constructive aspects of prospection. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the function of those subnetworks, the evaluative subnetwork and the constructive subnetwork within prospective decision-making about the future. Okay, but first, fractionating the prospective brain. And so, we're just going to take a tiny step here towards functional specialization, and rather than treat these areas of the default mode network as just one homogeneous thing, we're going to start to talk about subnetworks within the default mode network. Take this as a first step towards understanding functional specialization within this realm. And even if you look at resting state data, what you can see is if you run out the solutions to those resting state networks, and instead of saying, well, let's divide the brain into approximately about half a dozen networks based on their functional connectivity at resting state, let's actually divide those networks up further into maybe a dozen or 15 or 20. What you'll see is that you start to see some divisions between the subnetworks of the default mode network. And it varies a little bit depending on the method that you're using, and there's some debate within the resting state community of exactly how you want to divide it up. Turns out that doesn't matter so much, that level of detail doesn't matter so much to what we're going to do. I'm going to use a division of the default mode network into dorsal and ventral, but everything that I'm going to tell you about works for other sort of subdivisions that roughly map on to these networks. And so the dorsal default mode network is sort of your classic default mode, has medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate as key nodes. And the ventral default mode network has sort of retrosplenial cortex here, precuneus. There's also some aspects of more medial and central OFC, but also a key node in the ventral default mode network is the hippocampus. And in thinking about what these subcomponents of the default mode network might do, we get a little bit of inspiration from what Dan Gilbert has written about the function of prospection. And so in a paper that's several years old right now, Gilbert says about why it is that we have this ability to prospect. He says, when faced with decisions about future events, the cortex generates simulations, briefly tricking subcortical systems into believing that those events are unfolding in the present, and then taking note of the feelings these systems produce. And the argument that we want to make is that at a functional level, I think he's gotten it exactly right, that there's sort of two big functional components of this, one that's about generating simulations, and one that's about taking note of the feelings or evaluating those simulations. I think the anatomical mapping, so I think that's absolutely right, and I think the anatomical mapping that he proposes of this being cortical and this being subcortical is absolutely wrong. And so the hypothesis that we're going to lay out is that those two subcomponents, the constructive subcomponent of generating the simulations and the evaluative subcomponent of saying, are the things in the simulations good or bad, or those things that I should approach or avoid, map onto the subcomponents of the default mode network. And just as sort of motivation for that hypothesis, you can look at different groups in terms of how they talk about default mode network function. And there's definitely a group of people who study the default mode network who talk about its function in terms of generating simulations, in terms of generating scenes, in terms of bringing up and constructing scenes. People like Randy Buckner or Dan Schachter focus on that function of the default mode network. And generally, when they talk about that function, they point to areas that are classically thought of as maybe being involved in episodic memory, like the hippocampus and the retrosplenial cortex. And so they talk about that aspect of the default mode network with respect to construction. But then there's other groups like my previous postdoctoral advisor, Paul Glimcher, but lots of other people who talk about default mode network function in terms of evaluation and decision making. And when they are talking about the default mode network, they tend to be talking about areas like medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex. And so the motivation here for this study is to actually test this hypothesis that the constructive aspects are in the ventral DMN and the evaluative aspects are in the dorsal DMN. And so how do we go about establishing that functional specialization? And here, in the design of this study, we take some inspiration from another paper that I love a lot from a colleague of mine, Saul Sternberg, who's written a lot about how it is that you go about establishing the modularity of different functional modules or different neural modules, and the importance of establishing separate modifiability as a marker of modularity. So in this paper in 2001, Saul writes, how can we divide a complex mental process into meaningful parts? In this paper, I explore an approach in which processes are divided into parts that are modular in the sense of being separately modifiable. Evidence for separate modifiability is provided by an instance of selective influence. Two factors, F and G, usually experimental manipulations, such that part A is influenced by F, but invariant with respect to G, while part B is influenced by G, but invariant with respect to F. Such evidence also indicates that the modules are functionally distinct. So for the students in the room, I think what I take from this, we're very good, within cognitive neuroscience at least, at establishing the influence part of the equation. So we do a lot of writing saying, I've got a manipulation, and that manipulation pushes around activity in this region, right? And so that part of the equation we've been very, very good at. But we have not paid as much attention to the second half of this kind of double dissociation type logic, which is establishing not influence, but invariance, that this manipulation doesn't have an effect on some other region. And what Saul is pointing out is that if you really want to say that there are two functionally distinct pieces, you want to show that this piece can be influenced by something that this piece is not influenced by. So we have influence on A and invariance on B, and the other half of the double dissociation, vice versa, influence on B and invariance on A. And so that's what we tried to do. This is joint work with a graduate student, Trishala, a former graduate student, Trishala Parthasarati, where we tried to establish the separate modifiability of the dorsal and the ventral default mode networks. And so here we're going to, what we're going to do, this is actually for those of you in the room who know my work on decision making. This is, we're really getting far out into the prospection land. This is sort of a kind of study that I had to take a ginger step and go, okay, we'll give it a shot. We're going to have people imagine future events. That's going to be the task. And we're going to manipulate the vividness of those events under the hypothesis that that taxes the constructive aspects of prospection. And then we're also going to manipulate the valence of those events under the hypothesis that that taxes the evaluative aspects of prospection. And our hypothesis and establishing separate modifiability then is going to be showing that this manipulation moves around the ventral default mode network, but not the dorsal. And this manipulation moves around the dorsal default mode network, but not the ventral. Okay, so here's the task. We have people lying in the scanner, and we just give them a cue. Imagine that you'll be lying on a beach in a beautiful tropical bay, and then they get 15 minutes to try to bring that to mind, close their eyes, bring that to mind, and imagine that event. 15 seconds, sorry, not 15 minutes. That would be long. And then we ask them at the end of the 15 seconds, how vividly did you imagine this event, from vague with no details to vivid and highly detailed? And we also ask them, how would you rate the valence of the emotions involved in this event, from very negative to very positive? And we selected these cues based on pre-testing in a 2x2 design. So we selected cues to either be high in vividness or low in vividness, and we selected cues to either be very positive or very negative. So sitting on a beach in a beautiful tropical bay is high vividness and very positive, but we filled out the other parts of that 2x2 design. These are just data to show you that our manipulation worked. So if you look, for example, at the valence ratings from negative to positive, our category of vivid positive and non-vivid positive are both rated very highly in terms of, are both rated very positively. Our category of vivid non-negative, vivid negative, and non-vivid negative are both rated very negative. And similarly, our manipulation works with respect to vividness. It doesn't matter whether it's positive or negative. The vivid events are rated as vivid, and the non-vivid events are rated as non-vivid. And so one of these bars here is the online subjects on the basis of which we selected these stimuli, and then the dark bars are the subjects who did the experiment in the scanner. And so with that set up, the test that we're going to do is we're going to take these maps of the dorsal default mode network and the ventral default mode network, and we're going to ask, are these areas manipulated by valence, but invariant with respect to vividness, and vice versa? And what we see is that if you compare the positive events to the negative events, the dorsal default mode network is influenced by valence. It's influenced by the evaluative demands. It shows more activity for the positive events than for the negative events. But the ventral default mode network is not moved around by valence. And we see the opposite result for vividness. The ventral default mode network is moved around by the vividness of the prospective events. It shows more activity for the more vivid events than for the less vivid events. But the dorsal default mode network is invariant with respect to the vividness of the imagined events. It's not influenced by the constructive demands. And so we take this as first evidence for functional specialization between these two networks, the ventral network being influenced when you tax the constructive demands for building the simulation, and the dorsal network being influenced when you tax the evaluative demands of, is this simulation something that I want to approach or to avoid? We also wanted to go one step further with these data. So this obviously is going from our definition of these events as vivid or non-vivid, and then doing a sort of forward analysis of the imaging data, looking at areas that are affected by these two manipulations. We also wanted to start to ask, can we do principled reverse inference? Can I build a neural classifier that would distinguish between positive versus negative events? And can I build a neural classifier that would distinguish between vivid versus non-vivid events, going the other direction, so using the neural data to predict the categories as opposed to using the categories to predict the neural data. And the student, this is just showing the selectivity here. The dorsal default mode network is selectively moved by valence, and the ventral is selectively moved by vividness. But in terms of building a whole brain classifier, this is work of another a student of mine, Arthur Lee. I'm going to walk you through the approach that we took to do using the neural data to predict the categories in this experiment. So obviously what we would like to do is, so what we want to do here is for each trial, predict whether it's a 1 or a 0, whether it's a positive trial or a negative trial, whether it's a high vivid trial or a low vivid trial. We're going to use the same approach for both. And we would like to use all of the neural data that we have to make that prediction. That neural data is some 80,000 voxels in the brain times n trials times p subjects. Obviously, this we have a problem here. We have more voxels here than we have trials that we would like to predict, so we need to do some form of data reduction. The data reduction that Arthur does here is just a simple PCA. So that principal components analysis is going to deconstruct this full matrix of brain data into P principal components, where each principal component has a degree of activity, a proportion of that trial's neural variance that principal component can account for that varies across trials. And then that principal component is also going to have a spatial map, so a spatial weighting. This principal component involves positive weighting on these aspects of the brain and negative weighting on these other aspects of the brain. And there's a weight for every voxel in the brain. Now with P principal components, now we can actually do the logistic regression. P is less than n at now, and we can do the logistic regression of the principal components against the trial category. This is just principal components regression for those of you who know this stuff. And that's going to give us a beta value for each of the principal components for predicting these outcomes, high versus low valence or high versus low vividness. And the last step that we're going to do is we're going to now back project these beta values using these spatial maps, which gives us a more interpretable way of looking at this predictor. So rather than looking at this predictor in terms of the beta values on the principal components, we're going to, each one of these is associated with a spatial map. So we can take that beta times that spatial map, and this beta times that spatial map, and this beta times that spatial map, add it all together, and re-express this predictor in terms of weights on the individual voxels. And that's because for several reasons, but the most obvious reason is that it's easier for us to now think about and interpret the weights when they're in voxel space than when they're in principal component space. All of this is, the training here is all cross-validated, and then there's a last step where we threshold the voxels. So this is going to give us a weight for all the voxels and all the brain, but some of those probably aren't terribly useful for the prediction. So we can use bootstrapping to select the voxels that are actually contributing to the prediction and threshold this whole brain map. And so what this now has done is it gives us a predictor that looks a lot like what cognitive neuroscientists are used to looking at, which is a whole brain map with a weight at each voxel. But now instead of that being an estimate of the activity at that voxel, it's an estimate of the weight that I would give to that voxel's activity in predicting the behavior. Okay. That's the method. We apply it to these data, and what do we see? This is what the whole brain predictor looks like for valence. And thankfully, given the earlier results I gave you, what that whole brain predictor pulls out now is a map that looks a lot like the dorsal default mode network. The strongest positive weights are in medial prefrontal cortex here and in posterior cingulate cortex here. And this is what the predictor looks like for vividness. And again, thankfully, it gives you weights on regions that are in the ventral default mode network. In particular, you get a strong positive weight in the hippocampus. But you're also getting weight in medial orbitofrontal cortex and central orbitofrontal cortex as well. And to me, this result is interesting because within decision neuroscience, there's been a lot of back and forth about the function of orbitofrontal cortex and medial prefrontal cortex, where you've got some people like me and like my postdoctoral advisor who really sort of push, that all of these signals are about evaluation and about value. And you've got other groups that are saying, no, there's a lot of stuff that's going on here that's sensory, that's about building a model. So you've got Yale Niv, who's talking about models of the task, and you've got Jeff Schoenbaum's work, who's saying, look, it's representing specific aspects of the reward that the animal is going to get. But if you look at those two groups, they're really pointing at different areas of this broad swath of cortex. And the folks who are emphasizing the evaluative signals tend to be pointing at this area in the frontal lobe on the medial wall. And the folks who are looking at those signals about representations of the details of the potential rewards tend to be pointing at medial and central OFC. Jeff Schoenbaum's recording in those areas. And so it seems like both of those groups are right. They're just right about different aspects of the default mode of these areas of orbitofrontal and ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And what's nice about this division between the medial wall and the central OFC is that it maps on very nicely to the anatomy. So this is old work by Joe Price, who's looked at the anatomy of these areas in the rat and in the monkey and in the human. This is his map of the human anatomy. And based just on the anatomical connections, Price makes an argument for two big networks here, one of which involves central OFC, and which he says this is getting all of the sensory input. This is probably more of a sensory area. It's getting input from all of the sensory regions. Also gets strong input from the hippocampus. And then he argues for a second network that involves more of the medial wall that he calls a visceromodal network that's obviously more about evaluation. It's connected to some of the subcortical regions like the amygdala. It's also connected to motor output regions. So it's about not just evaluation, but planning as well. And so the distinction between some of these regions being involved in construction and some of these regions being involved in evaluation, I think also maps on nicely to what we know about the anatomy. Okay, now I want to tell you a bit. Yeah, I can take a question. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so I think in terms of the predictive accuracy, I mean, some of this depends a little bit on how you define it. I mean, at the trial level, I think the predictive accuracy is around 60%. I could go back and check to get a more exact number offline. So it does have predictive accuracy. Obviously, it gets better if if you're averaging across trials rather than looking at accuracy at the trial level. Why do you use it as a mapping tool? Well, it does give you slightly different answers than the univariate GLM. I don't know that I have deep thoughts about why, but part of the reason why we were interested in it is because of how we're going to use it coming up in about 10, 15 minutes here. Yeah. 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 So, sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Why can we not have that and have differential modifiability in terms of plasticity mechanisms, different after inputs, etc.? In other words, they can be doing the same thing,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but be modified separately by different inputs. Is that not likely or why not?
Yeah. So I guess what you're let me see if I understand the question, which is about how much of the modifiability is about the processing that the area is doing versus the inputs. Is that a good? Yeah. So I think here we're not taking a strong. I don't know that I want to make a strong claim about which of those two accounts for the difference between the way in which these two networks are active during, when you're imagining the future. Because it could be that if you were able to trace out the circuit within the regions, the function of the circuit looks very similar. But as I showed you, orbitofrontal cortex is getting inputs more from sensory regions, and medial frontal cortex is getting some processed information from orbitofrontal cortex, and also some, and so it could be just that the inputs are different, but the processing is the same. But given the task and given the difference in the inputs, we're able to see the dissociation in terms of the functional activity. Is that, yeah? Okay. Happy to talk offline. Okay, so what I want to do in the second half of the talk is talk about how this relates to a bunch of other work that we've done trying to understand prospective decision-making, decisions about future rewards. And in all of that work, we've used a very basic choice task where we give people choices between more immediate monetary rewards and more delayed monetary rewards. So choices like this: would you rather have $20 now or $40 in 90 days? And this is usually the point in the talk where I spend about 5 minutes talking about delayed discounting and what it is and how you measure discount rates and how we take these choices and get a discount curve. But Warren literally wrote the book and is sitting in the front row. So I'm going to assume that there's some baseline familiarity in this audience about what discounting is. So what we're interested in getting from these choices is, for each individual, and what we're going to concentrate a lot on, is a discount rate, which measures basically how patient or impatient the subject is. And I do want to show you this slide that's sort of part of my normal spiel, just because when I talk about there being individual differences in discounting, I think it's useful to express what the scale of those individual differences is. These are not selected subjects at all. These are the first 10 subjects I ever estimated a discount curve for. And what you see here in the first 10 subjects is huge individual differences in the extent to which delayed rewards are discounted relative to immediate rewards. So this subject has a very low discount rate. They're very patient. They would choose $21 in 60 days over $20 today. This subject, who is also in those first 10 subjects, I don't have an estimate of the indifference point out here at 60 days, because this was when I was a postdoc with Paul, and when we got up to $250, we're giving real rewards. in this task. And when we got up to saying, do you want $250 in 2 months or $20 today? And the subject said no, Paul said, stop. We're not offering him anymore. So this subject would turn down $200 in 2 months. This subject would take $21 over $20 today in 2 months. So huge individual differences that you can get. You don't have to sample hundreds and hundreds of people to get those tail ends. And even in these first 10 people, we got a sense that this is related to their behavior outside of the lab. I know there's, and again, Warren sort of wrote the book on this about what discount rates can predict. But even in these 10 people, this was a medical resident, and this person took the money from the experiment and went on a skydiving trip and sent me some really awesome pictures, right? So, so what we measure in the lab is related to how they behave outside of the lab. And the initial study that we did on delay discounting with respect to the brain was just looking for signals related to their evaluation of the delayed reward, whether they thought the delayed reward was, how valuable did they find the delayed reward? And so the approach was we have people doing a whole bunch of these different choices between $20 now. In this case, we're going to fix the immediate reward, and we're going to vary the delayed reward, both the amount and the delay to the delayed reward. We have a measure of their discount function, so I know for each subject, I can put a number on how valuable this reward is relative to this reward for each subject. For YH, $32 in 60 days is a lot more valuable than $20 now. For CH, I just told you they would turn down $200 in 60 days, so $32 in 60 days is almost nothing. And then we can use that estimate of the value of the delayed reward and ask where in the brain is there activity that goes up and down with the subjective value of the delayed reward as determined by that subject's idiosyncratic discount function. And this is the first study we did where we find medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, so dorsal default mode network here, connected with ventral striatum. And this was more than 10 years ago now. In my own lab, we've replicated this basic finding in terms of these areas tracking the evaluation of the delayed reward at least 4 times, and I think this list probably isn't complete, different studies where we're able to replicate this basic finding of these regions tracking the evaluation of the delayed reward. And for the students in the audience, if you want some estimate going forward of what the expected sample size of a study is going to be, this study I was able to publish 12 years ago with 10 subjects. Our most recent study here in 2017 was over 100 subjects. So we're increasing by a factor of 10 every decade. So if you're projecting out to 2027, we're going to be we might be in the thousands in terms of these typical imaging studies. And we've shown that that this feature of these regions tracking the subjective value of potential rewards is not just about the delayed discounting task. So this is results from a meta-analysis that our group did where across 200 plus neuroimaging studies where we're asking across all of those studies, where are there reliable activations? Brain regions are showing more activity for more valuable either potential outcomes or outcomes. The regions here are ones that show increased activity for more valuable outcomes, both in the domain of monetary rewards and in the domain of primary rewards. They show this feature of increased activity for more valuable outcomes, both prospectively when you're making decisions about those outcomes, and at the time of consumption when you're actually receiving those outcomes. And these areas show that kind of pattern and definitively don't show a pattern that has to do with salience. So they show this, they don't ever show increased activity for less valuable outcomes, even when you move into the domain of, say, negative outcomes, where the less valuable outcome is now much more salient because it's a big punishment. And so, and the areas that come out of that are ventromedial prefrontal cortex and ventral striatum that we saw in the discounting study. And so now we've started, in terms of looking at these evaluative brain responses, we have started to move into looking at these evaluative brain responses in the context of clinical disorders. And in particular, you might think that that these brain regions would reflect something about the degree to which, the way in which you're evaluating things in your life. And in particular, we, in the next study that I'll tell you about, we're interested in the relationship between these evaluative responses and anhedonia. Now, a lot of people think of anhedonia as being about consumptive processes, so I get a reward and that doesn't make me as happy as other people. But clinically, what people are starting to recognize is that a big component of anhedonia is not necessarily about consumption, but about anticipation and decision making. That when I prospectively think about potential rewards, I don't find them as motivating. I don't want to get up off the couch and go out to get a drink with my friends. That doesn't motivate me as much as perhaps other people do. And so what we wanted to look at was relating and so our hypothesis here is that maybe when you look at these evaluative signals, maybe in anhedonia, the difference between a very high value outcome and a very low value outcome when you're making decisions is just scrunched down relative to people who are non-anhedonic. That's the hypothesis that we wanted to test. We did it in the context of the delay discounting task just because we really understand the evaluative brain responses within that task. This is work with a graduate student, a clinical psychology graduate student of mine, Min Kang. And we were interested in looking at anhedonia transdiagnostically. So we brought in healthy subjects, subjects with major depression, subjects with bipolar disorder, and subjects with schizophrenia, because in all of those disorders, there's a component of anhedonia. In all 4 disorders, we're measuring anhedonia with something called the Canes. This is just a clinical interview for anhedonia. And what I'm plotting here is we're just going to take that ventromedial prefrontal cortex area from the meta-analysis that I just showed you, and we're going to look at the degree to which activity in that region reflects the subjective value of the delayed reward. That's what's on the y-axis here. So that's some index of how much discrimination there is in this subject between the most valuable offers in the delay discounting task and the least valuable offers. And what we find is that value-related activity in the VMPFC goes down as a function of anhedonia. It's not something about disorder. So if we look at it in a categorical manner, there's no effect of your diagnosis. The only significant effect here is across diagnoses as a function of anhedonia. And this holds up to controlling for diagnosis. It also holds up for controlling for a bunch of other confounds that you might think of. And for those who are interested, I'm happy to kind of go through all of the potential confounds that we threw at it. But suggesting that maybe these evaluative brain responses could serve as a measure, a potential measure that's useful in reflecting transdiagnostic clinical phenomena. Okay, in the last part of the talk, what I want to talk about is, so I just told you a little bit about what we've seen in terms of the evaluative brain networks, their function during prospective decision-making, during delay discounting. Now I want to turn to what do we see about the function of the constructive half of this and the ventral default mode network. Now we're going to get at Stephen's question. So why, for one reason why we did the classification analysis that we did of that first prospection study is that those whole brain classifiers now give us a tool to ask a long-standing question in the field, which is, why is it that delayed rewards are discounted? Why is it that something that's in the future is not perceived as valuable as something that's available today? And one hypothesis that's been out there in a couple of different forms is that the reason why the delayed rewards are discounted is something about the vividness or the salience of delayed rewards relative to immediate rewards. Something about delayed rewards being less vividly being able to be brought to mind than immediate rewards. You see this in psychology and temporal construal theory, where Jakob Trope argues that when things are delayed, we think about them in a more abstract manner, whereas when things are immediate, we think about them in a more concrete manner. George Lowenstein has written about this, that delayed rewards tend to be more intangible. They tend to be more intangible things, and we tend to think about them in a more intangible way, whereas immediate rewards tend to be tangible, and we tend to think about things that are immediate in a more tangible way. In computational neuroscience, this is a paper that Warren has published with Dave Reddish, where there's a model, again, that the reason why, if you look at the way that this model works, the reason why delayed rewards are discounted is something about your ability to bring that delayed reward to mind. That there's something that's keeping you from being able to actually access what the delayed reward is. And so now we think that the tools from our whole brain classifier give us a way to actually test this idea in a non-obtrusive way, not asking people, as they're doing the task, well, are you thinking about the delayed rewards more vividly or less vividly? What's going on in your head? But in a non-obtrusive way to ask, does that whole brain signature of vivid thinking, is that reduced as we increase the delay to the delayed reward? And so that is what Arthur used these whole brain classifiers for. So just to remind you, he built the classifier on the prospection data. So he built the classifier on subjects who are in the scanner, imagining being on a beach, beautiful beach in a tropical bay, trying to classify whether they're imagining vividly or not vividly, or positive versus negative. And we're going to just apply those classifiers to scanner data that we have in the delay discounting task. And the hypothesis is that vividness will be selectively moved around by the delay of the delayed reward. First, though, I want to show you what the results of the classifier are for valence, just to as like a sanity check. Here we have clear predictions, and because the valence classifier also maps on to those regions that we know are involved in value, what we should see with the valence classifier is that as the amount of the delayed reward goes up, it gets more valuable. The valence classifier goes up. As the delay to delayed reward goes up, it gets less valuable, so the valence classifier goes down, and there should be a strong relationship between subjective value by that subject's discount rate and what the output of the valence classifier is. And that's what we see. Strong positive relationship with amount, strong negative relationship with delay, and a strong positive relationship with value. And we see exactly what we would predict with the vividness classifier. In the vividness classifier, it's not picking up, it's not being modulated by the amount of the delayed reward, but it's very strongly being modulated by the delay. So this neural signature of vivid imagination is increasing as for trials in which the delayed reward is closer in time, and decreasing as we move that delayed reward farther out in time. Because of that, there's also, because delay modulates value, there is a significant, though smaller, effect on value. And because both of these are picking up aspects of value, we can use both of these classifiers to predict choice at above chance accuracy. Yeah? This is a correlation between, it's trial by trial. So on each trial, we have a delayed reward. We're keeping the immediate reward fixed, $20 now, and we have a delayed reward. And so for that delayed reward, there's an amount and a delay. In this experiment, those are orthogonal, so they're not related to each other. We sample the entire space, which allows us to tease apart the two. And on that trial, we get a trial-wise measure of activity in every voxel. And so we just use that trial-wise measure of what's the activity on that trial, and then put it through the whole brain, the map of weights from the Vividness classifier and say, what would the output of that classifier be? And we take that continuous measure, relate it to delay, and that's where we see the correlation. Okay. So if it's true that what drives the discounting process is something about your ability to vividly bring to mind future delays, then we would also expect that the areas that are brought up in this classifier would be the brain areas where structure and function is related to individual differences in discounting. And so we've started to look at that structurally. In this study with a former student of mine, Marietta Palavanova, we looked at just cortical thickness. This is a study of over 400 adolescent subjects. So we have a discount rate, and then we have measures of cortical thickness. It's mostly adolescents. There's some younger kids, some young adults. And then we have a measure of cortical thickness. And these are all the regions where cortical thickness is related to discount rate. So there's lots of areas of the brain where, all in one direction, reduced cortical thickness, higher discount rate. So lots of areas where reduced cortical thickness is associated with higher discount rate. But the places where the association is strongest are shown here in green. And it's very interesting that that basically outlines medial orbitofrontal cortex, central orbitofrontal cortex, lateral orbitofrontal cortex, and anterior temporal lobe and areas of the medial temporal lobe. So exactly the areas that we would expect if we were trying to make a prediction based on that vividness map. We would expect that the hot spot for the association would be in orbitofrontal cortex. We have now replicated this in a young adult sample. That's work of a postdoc, a former postdoc of mine, Wei-Hun Zheng. So this is now an older adult, sorry, not an older adult, a young adult sample, about 200 subjects. Again, looking at gray matter volume and where is reduced gray matter volume associated with higher discounting. Again, you get central OFC, and anterior temporal lobe and parts of the medial temporal lobe as well. So reduced structural integrity of these regions associated with the ventral DMN is associated with increased discounting. We've now also looked at data, looked at behavioral data. And so how can we get at behavioral indices of the outputs of the function of these regions? And can we relate that to discount rate? And in particular, we're interested in, we'd be very interested in behavioral measures of the quality of your prospection. But I'm not sure that we're quite there yet in terms of reliability and validity of those kinds of measures. So instead of thinking about going out of the here and now into the future, we've started out with behavioral measures of getting out of the here and now into the past. So we've been looking at behavioral measures of episodic memory ability and qualities of your episodic and autobiographical memories. This is work of a postdoc of mine, Carolina Lempert. And so Carolina has looked at this in a couple of different studies. And all of this is in older adults, in an older adult sample where we get more variability in your memory abilities and the qualities of your memory. And so in the first study, she just looked in this older adult cohort. We're collaborating with the Aging Center at Penn, about 100 subjects, and said, is discount rate related to episodic memory, and is it related to executive function? And so we've got a composite measure of episodic memory and a composite measure of episodic executive function. For anyone who's interested, I can go into the individual components of this, but these are sort of classic neuropsychological tests of executive function. These are all recall tasks for episodic memory. And what Carolina sees is a strong negative relationship between episodic memory and discount rate. So the people who are the highest discounters in the sample are the ones who have the poorest episodic memory. But she doesn't see in this sample where there's a lot of variability in cognitive functioning because of aging, she doesn't see an association between discounting and executive function. In a follow-up, we're a little bit worried. So one thing to note about this is that this sample includes both people who would be classified as healthy, as well as people who would be classified as having mild cognitive impairment. And a lot of this variability in the episodic memory measure, the episodic memory measure is sort of, it's calibrated to pick up NCI. It's not calibrated to pick up variability in healthy memory. And so all of the variability in this study is really about variability within the MCI group. So we wanted to follow up on that and try and get at a measure of memory quality that would be more calibrated to variability within the healthy sample, and also focus just on healthy older adults. And so what Carolina did was, as part of another, what she did was bring in healthy older adults and have them do an autobiographical memory interview in which they got a cue about different autobiographical events in their life. And then they talked about those events in detail. They explained everything that happened on their wedding day, and we recorded it. And then we had people go through and code those stories for the degree to which they had certain kinds of details within them. Whether they had details about the timing of the events within the story, whether they had details about the place that different events in the story happened, different details about the perceptual things that were going on in the story, affective details, and several other categories of details. And what we found was that there was a strong relationship, particularly between the number of details about time and place and discount rate, such that people who provided more details in their autobiographical memories about the timing of events, more details about the particular places that events happened, tended to have lower discount rates in this sample, and subjects who had less details had higher discount rates. What's interesting about the specificity of that, one is it makes it, there's some language confounds that we worry about. Some people are simply more verbose than others, right? So it's not verbosity. But when you think about medial temporal lobe function, again here, we know that there are specific regions within the medial temporal lobe that have place cell representations. And it's those same regions where people are now finding representations of time, and so where we're sort of want to go in the future is now looking at an even lower level of granularity. Can we find relationships at those structural levels between the regions that we know have representations of time and place and discount rate? And can we interrogate the function of those areas when people are making delayed discounting decisions? So just to wrap up and summarize, showed you in the first half of the talk that the dorsal and ventral default mode networks are separately modifiable by evaluative and constructive demands during prospection. The evaluative networks track the discounted or subjective value of delayed rewards during prospective decisions, and these neural evaluative responses are diminished in anhedonia. And the constructive brain networks are uniquely modulated by delay during prospective decisions, and diminished cortical thickness in these regions and diminished constructive abilities, diminished aspects of episodic memory are associated with increased discounting of delayed rewards. I'll end there. I'll take questions. I should acknowledge. I tried to acknowledge all of the students along the way who played a key role in the individual studies, but these are all my students and lab alumni and collaborators and funding agencies. And I thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions. Read.
Can you go back a couple slides to the memory task?
This one?
Yeah. So when you get a plot like that, you bring your people back in 6 months later. That's the data on the same spot.
Yeah, that's great. So,
Because old people can back away, possibly, right? You don't or is that something that
So we would, we would like to do that. To look, so there's two aspects of bringing them back in. One is what's the retest reliability of these measures, and I'd like to know this a little bit better than I do. It's a lot of work to get these measures out of the. It's just a study that takes a lot of time to get these measures out of the autobiographical interviews. So I think that there's some data out there on reasonable reliabilities, but I'd like to know that a little bit better. But the other aspect of bringing them back is that they're changing, right? And so what you'd really like to see to really make the link, the kind of causal link between these abilities and discounting, would be to see that as these abilities diminish, they're usually going in that direction, unfortunately. As these abilities diminish, does that predict change? You'd like to see diminishment predicting change in the discount function, and that's something that we're definitely planning on doing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There could also be variability within a person across time. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's, yeah. It's clear, yeah. The other one is clearly, the variability and the relationship is all in the NCI. Yeah. So, I mean, in this case, no, because there are people who try and do this, and you're pointing it out. We're wading into it, and part of the reason that we started with memory was we thought we'd have a better chance there at nailing some of this stuff down than if we sort of started with, episodic future thinking tasks. But yeah, you'd really like to nail down. So what people have done in autobiographical memory to try and nail down accuracy is to ask about things where they do have so, you know, ask you questions about, you know, where you went to high school or did your high school football team win the championship of your senior year that they can actually verify. I mean, this is stuff where to verify it, I'd have to do, you know, they're talking about their daughter's wedding, and so I'd have, you know, I couldn't do that by going to the, you know, going to, you know, going to an objective source. I'd then have to bring the daughter in, and then I'd have to worry about, is her perception different than their perception of what happened? So, yeah, so we're kind of taking their memory at face value. Yeah. Sure. Sure.